So, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Ivey Idea Forum on Inclusive Leadership. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, and we're going to focus on the lands that Western University is on. But since we're on Zoom, we're all on different lands, so we encourage you to focus and think about the lands that you're on as we do this. Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinonton nations. The land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples who are contemporary stewards of the land as well as vital contributors to society. In this location, the First Nations often made agreements under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. And I think this is a really interesting foundation for us today. When the dish has one spoon, then we need to pass it around and all eat from the same bowl. So we all need to share and respect each other in the space where we are. We rely on each other and we help each other. And this is a really important foundation from First Nations teachings for us today. I'm Martha Masnevsky. I'm a professor of organizational behavior, and I'm the faculty director of lifelong learning at Ivey. Under Ivey's new strategic plan, our goal of lifelong learning is to help leaders develop a habit of deliberately engaging in learning experiences every day to support your personal and professional lives. We're especially focused on three critical issues that Ivey has identified as crucial to the business and society: sustainability, Canada's role in the world, and the issue we're here today to discuss, the evolution of work. In our idea forums, we engage in dialogue across research and practice, pushing the boundaries of both. So our particular learning objectives here today are to help you become more ready to strengthen and transfer the skills you already have into more inclusive leadership. Second, we want you to walk away wanting to coach and develop others to power up their skills for inclusive leadership. And finally, we'd like to leave you curious about where more inclusive leadership can take you and the people around you. Now, if we can share the intro slide, Rebecca. I think it's the next one. There we go. Just a kind of an overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to start with some dialogue from the panelists, and then we'll integrate questions and responses from you, the participants. Along the way, we're going to address the questions that were sent to us in advance. So thank you for doing that. And it was great to have those to structure our discussion and build in, and we'll certainly try and come to those. Now, there may be, as you can imagine, some sensitive discussions today or some comments or questions that you or other people react to in strong and emotional ways differently. We are very committed to shaping a place of respectful dialogue. We want people to have their thoughts and to be able to express them, and it's very important that people are respectful to the diversity of views that may be here. So we invite you to shape that space with us. I'm going to be monitoring the chat and summarizing questions and themes from the chat. So as you think of things or bring up questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. That's where I'll be hanging out. And as we get to the question part at the end, we may actually ask some people to unmute and kind of say a bit more about your question. The session is going to be recorded. The link will be distributed to you after the session, and it's also going to be posted on our research website with a summary. And we hope that you'll be able to use the dialogue with other people that you work with and are important to you. We're also going to be sending a follow-up document with some exercises and resources for you. And after the session, we'd love to hear from you. What other sessions would be helpful? What kind of format? So stay tuned for that QR code. Okay, if we can put the slide down now, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and maybe we can, we are spotlighted, yeah. So if you go on gallery view, you'll see everybody with our panelists at your top left. And if you go onto speaker view, you'll see bigger the four panelists and myself, and the rest of you in a stream there too. So you can pick your view on that. But I'd like to introduce the four panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. I'm going to go in reverse order of how you're going to hear from them formally. So let me start with Barnini Bhattacharya. Barnini is a professor of organizational behavior at Ivey. She's been with us since 2022. Sorry, not 19. That was me. She did her PhD at the University of British Columbia. And before she devoted her career to academics, she worked in banking and nonprofit sectors across different geographies. And this experience really shapes both her research and her teaching. Barnini's research focuses on how to create more inclusive systems and environments. She has particular expertise in intersectionality, women of color, and allyship. Today, she's going to share the results of her groundbreaking research on this, highlighting the lessons for being an ally. She's an immigrant settler from India, living in London, and is driven by goals of decolonization and justice. And she loves her 4-year-old Australian Shepherd dog, whose name is Ringo, and is delightful. Shannon Roski is also a professor of organizational behavior at Ivey. She's been with us since 2021. And she did her PhD at the University of Arkansas. Before coming to Ivey, she was a professor in Wisconsin, and she also consults with compliance training providers for a lot of Fortune 500 companies. These experiences shape her research and teaching today. Shannon's especially interested in how people develop their sense of identity and the impact that different sources of identity have on how people respond to being asked to change. Specifically, as she'll share today, she's done groundbreaking work on sexual harassment behaviors and sexual harassment training effectiveness, work that teaches us a lot about constructive learning in the EDI space. Family, home time, and creativity are really important to Shannon, and that family includes a lovely and much-loved corgi named Badger. Kimberly Messer is the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at IGM Financial and a longtime champion for inclusive leadership. She started her career as a teacher, then became a software developer, a people manager, a business development, and now a DEI leader, which I think brings all of those things in together. Along the way, she became an active advocate for 2S LGBTQIA+, including interesting work globally with clients at IBM and leadership roles in employee resource groups and Pride at Work Canada. What I read in all the interviews about her, articles about her, she has a deep curiosity for what people bring and equally strong enthusiasm for creating space for people to blossom in their own way. She talks about embracing her own identity as well. What comes across when you talk with her is how much delight and joy she feels in embracing other people's identity from their own perspective as well. Kim does not have a dog, but when she attended an event at the White House a few years ago, she did meet Bo and Sunny, the Obama's dogs, but not the Obamas. But that's cool, isn't it? Finally, our moderator today is Erin Hooner. Erin is the Director of Culture and Inclusion at Ivey and co-founder of our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Practice course for executives. She did her PhD in geography at Western, focusing on Indigenous perspectives of land and the role of storytelling. Along the way, she helped manage research in different parts of Western. Her identity as a mother of a neurodiverse child is also very core to her, and all of those experiences affect her practice today. As a settler to Canada, she starts her practice by listening and creating space for others to speak and listen. Like our panelists today, she has curiosity and respect for people's perspectives and lived experiences, and profound commitment to facilitating the creation of more constructive spaces. Now, Erin is a cat person. Her cat's name is Henry, but also goes by Enrique because her partner speaks Spanish. Apparently, Henry is poorly behaved in both official family languages. In other words, he's a cat. So at this point, I turn it over to Erin, and we will create the space for dialogue together here. Thanks very much to all our panel.
Thanks so much, Martha. I'm really happy to be here and welcome everyone. Today, we're going to get started by hearing stories, and we're going to hear stories from two very different perspectives in some ways. First, we're going to hear from Kim, and we're going to anchor her stories in her lived experience as a practitioner of inclusive practice within industry. We're then going to move to hear from my two wonderful colleagues, Shannon and Barnini, to articulate what can research tell us about practice, and then what can practice tell us about research. so that we can build out a really fulsome story for all of you to better understand how might you knit together research and practice within the spaces that you work in and you intend to practice inclusive practice in every day. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you. Maybe you can let us know, how did you come to this work? And what are some of the spaces that you've really been working on in intensive ways within your current space?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Martha. I always appreciate hearing my career summed up in 4 seconds or less. It's amazing. But maybe just to provide everyone some context about what has brought me to this work, as you alluded to in the introduction, I was thinking about this yesterday and realizing that 20 years have passed since I first sort of stepped into this work, sort of unaware of where it was about to lead me and take me throughout my career. But as Martha mentioned, I did spend 21 years with IBM. Let's just call it what it is, IBM, and spent most of that time in the software development space. And so when I think about my early sort of ventures into diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was going into middle schools and teaching girls to code. It was all about increasing the pipeline and really helping to raise awareness in certainly junior high school and in high schools with girls, and really getting them excited about the opportunities that science, technology, and engineering could afford them. And I also, during my early days at IBM, was struggling with my sexual orientation. And I was very, very fortunate to find myself working for an organization that was incredibly progressive when it came to not only LGBT inclusion, but inclusion more broadly. And through that work, I found a community, I found an employee resource group, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term, that really allowed me to blossom and to find that community at work, while I was continuing to struggle both in both a personal and in a family life. And so I remain forever grateful to IBM and to finding myself in this fortunate situation. And I really embraced it. And so I jumped in with both feet and got actively involved with the employee resource group at the time, taking on leadership roles. And I've always been such a huge proponent of the power of inclusive workplaces to really bring out the best in people, because I know it did for me. And it really did change my career trajectory. It provided me opportunities, visibility to senior leadership, and led me to the global LGBT business development team that Martha mentioned earlier, which did really force me, out of my comfort zone and really get out there and speak to clients and multinational corporations and really help them reflect and learn from the things that we were doing at IBM at the time. And just over the course of years and months, I found myself doing this work in a more deep and thoughtful way. And, through that led to an opportunity to come and do this work at IGM Financial. And so I was telling Erin prior to this that, I have a whole new appreciation because consulting and advising and giving people guidance is very different than doing the heavy lifting and doing the work. So I've certainly come to appreciate that. So this remains near and dear to my heart. And that's partly why I'm so passionate about ensuring that our workplaces are creating those spaces where people of all identities can truly thrive. So on the question of kind of what brings us here today, there's a few things, opportunities and challenges that I think about as a D&I practitioner. I really think about the work that I do in a maturity curve model, which I think some of you, may be familiar with. And I want to talk about that in just a moment. The other is how we scale and diffuse responsibility to everyone. That's one of the biggest challenges that I face as a D&I practitioner. And also the role of inclusive leadership capabilities in supporting both the maturity model, but also the scaling of an inclusive culture. So really quickly, I want to touch on this idea of a maturity model because it really does ground the work that I do from a D&I practitioner perspective. And so the model really, and I'll just be very quick, and I realize I don't have slides on this, but it's around compliance, it's then programmatic, it's then business-led and integrated. So if you think about compliance, and I hope not too many organizations are sitting in a compliance mode today, but it largely is around legal and risk mitigation, and DEI is seen as something that's managed. So I'd like to think that most of us have moved beyond that. But level 2 is really about programmatic, and that's how a lot of organizations still think about diversity, equity, inclusion. We see an articulated business case. Diversity is seen in terms of demographic numbers. We have a lot of standalone initiatives, things that, like I mentioned, mentoring, unconscious bias, employee resource groups. But really, it's that move to that next phase and those next two phases where diversity, equity, inclusion truly is led by the business and then ultimately integrated into everything that you do is really where the deep work is in this space. And quite frankly, a lot of organizations still really struggle in moving their organizations, into those more evolved states where the work is led by the business and also embedded into everything that the organization does. So how does this relate in terms of the context of kind of what we're talking about today? So there's a lot of things, and I know we're going to talk about a lot of different themes over the next 60 minutes or so. But for me, I think the tipping point for a lot of organizations, or that, they really fail to reach that tipping point, is moving from programmatic to really inspiring culture change. And we do our best to really try to bring people along in that journey, but it's not easy. And it hasn't been easy for a long time. And I think historically leaders have been able to push back. They've been able to show resistance and somehow believe that this work didn't involve them or include them in a meaningful way. But I think what we're seeing in society right now, and the narrative and the discourse that's happening, that, the apathy and the idea that this doesn't impact me as a leader is really becoming less realistic. And, when we think about leadership, especially leaders who've been in their roles for a long time, we try to get them to think about, well, what got you here is not going to get you there. I believe, and I know that I'm biased sitting in the position that I'm in today, but that ability to lead inclusively is really everything. It's a new currency. And so I hope through the conversation today, we're going to be able to touch on some of the ways you can really activate that currency for yourself. And it's also really important that narrative is around reminding leaders that they're not bad leaders, they're not bad people, but really helping leaders pay attention to the things that are impacting their teams and impacting their team's ability to be productive. So this is a new competency that we think leaders really need to embrace. And it's our job as D&I practitioners to really create the space where leaders can seize that opportunity. And then finally, I don't know how much time we have left, Erin. I meant to start my timer and I forgot. So, but just to say that, from that final point and leading into some of the things that Barnini is going to be talking about, when I think about inclusive leadership, it also includes allyship. And allyship is such a critical component to both culture change and inclusive leadership. And it really gives us an opportunity. And I don't think that true culture change can happen without allyship. So, in a few minutes, Barnini's going to talk a little bit more about that. But I've always felt, and very strongly, and I think the research does support that the very small changes in behavior are really what can make a world of difference in an organization. So as much as D&I practitioners, we feel like we are kind of pushing things onto the organization, we really want to shift that. So what we're pulling, or ultimately, I'll say holding hands in terms of bringing people along in that journey. And no matter what we lead or what work we lead as D&I practitioners, we know that the most important work is happening in the individual interactions that are happening throughout the day. And so allyship is a way to really distribute and change behavior across the organization. And it really gives people an opportunity to play an active role. So, when I think about those micro moments and all the ways that we can affect how people truly feel about the organization, I do see allyship as such an important component of that. And finally, just to say, the most common question that I get asked is, what can I do and how do I start? And I think allyship really gives us the tools and the language and the permission to engage. And it's really an invitation to engage. It's an invitation to our leaders. And so if we can really get that right and really help shift that center of gravity from, D&I leaders and centers of expertise really feeling like they're leading the work to, putting that power and opportunity and empowerment into the hands of leaders across the organization, you're really going to see some long-term and impactful change.
Thank you so much, Kim. What I heard you really articulate for us, and I think this is a wonderful lead-off point to have Barnini and Shannon speak in, but is that we're really talking about a new competency framework for leaders to have to engage in. If we really want to move across that, those evolved states, right? If we want to get to the higher end where we're deeply embedded across all aspects of our industry or business, what is this new competency model that we need to start effectively thinking about? So I'm wondering, Shannon, if you could co-locate what you understand and what you do from a research perspective to help us better understand what might some of those skills be that we start to align within this more evolved competency model that allows us to really start thinking fruitfully about what an inclusive workplace might look like.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Erin. And thank you, Kim, for sharing your experiences with us today. I did prepare a couple slides, and I'd like to start with just an overview of some of the research that I've been engaged in recently. Up on the screen, I have 4 interrelated research areas and some questions that I've been asking within these areas. So as Martha mentioned in my introduction, I primarily study sexual harassment, the behavior, and also sexual harassment training effectiveness. That sort of leads into bystander intervention research as well, and how that relates back to training. How do we train bystanders? And then a new area that I'm very interested in is trauma-informed perspectives in the workplace. So within the field of sexual harassment, one question that I've been asking is, how do work groups make sense of sexual behaviors at work, and how do they form norms around these behaviors? So when you hear about a really toxic work environment where there's a lot of sexual harassment going on, and maybe eventually there's a big splash in the media, a big scandal, but you sort of scratch your head and you wonder, well, how did it get to that point in the first place? It probably never should have gotten that severe. So if you can click next for the animation, what I've found is that when work groups start framing sexual behavior, like sexual joke telling, sexual storytelling, when they start framing this behavior as playful, it makes it seem more acceptable in their work environment, because when we engage in human play, we enter sort of a realm that doesn't feel real. It feels almost make-believe, the way that children play pretend. And we can do this as adults as well. And so we allow behaviors that maybe don't necessarily fit in a professional work environment because they are framed socially as playful. However, when you make something playful, one of the goals of play is to engage in that behavior frequently, almost as a routine. The goal of play is the process itself, not its end result. So that's why kids always want to play the same thing over and over and over and over again. And the same thing with adults at play. So we end up seeing that when sexual behaviors are framed as play, they tend to happen more frequently, and they become more severe or more extreme over time because everybody's sort of trying to outdo each other in terms of engaging in that play. And this is especially true in the context of a hyper-competitive hierarchy, because folks who are lower on the power hierarchy will be too afraid to challenge the play norm, or to argue against it, or to bring the play back to reality, back to a more serious tone, and maybe question the nature of the play. So a lot of times people without power will just kind of smile and nod or laugh at the joke and try to get out of the room. They're just trying to do their job. But it sends the signal to the high power folks that everyone's okay with this, and then the behavior perpetuates. So those power hierarchies, especially if there's a culture of hyper internal competition, can really undermine professional norms over time. And that goes right along with a lack of organizational policy. So if there is nowhere to report, or you don't know where to report, there's just no good policy or procedure around responding to sexual harassment in the workplace, that can really set the tone for more severe behaviors over time. Now that brings me to sexual harassment training research, which was the focus of my dissertation work and a lot of my work since. And I started out with the question, well, why do people seem to react so negatively to this type of training? And do these negative reactions mean the training's ineffective? At the time, folks said, oh, they don't need to like it. It's just compliance training. And so long as we check that compliance box, the training is effective. So if you click to the next, I think, So what I found is that individuals actually feel threatened by compliance-oriented sexual harassment training because that training focuses so heavily on the negative roles of harasser and victim. And no one in the training audience wants to be either a harasser or a victim. So in an effort to sort of protect their sense of self, we find that people will backlash against the training and actually be motivated to engage in some of the behaviors the training is asking them to stop. So you might see actually an increase in sexual jokes, sexual storytelling after a sexual harassment training program because folks feel threatened by it and they're trying to delegitimize the training and prove, the work group doesn't have to listen to this. I'm not a harasser. I'm not a victim. I want to be included in this work group. Don't ostracize me based on what you heard on in this training. And what I've found since is that if we just reframe the message of training to offer positive roles, as you heard Kim mention, an ally role, or I've redesigned training to offer a hero role, these positive roles and teaching people what they should do actually reduces the threatened effects and people learn more and backlash less against training. And really, you can have a very similar knowledge content. So you can say in compliance training, don't do these behaviors, you potential harassers, and it will threaten people. But you can show, examples of the same exact behaviors and say, if you see these, here's an opportunity for you to step in and be an ally. And that works so much better. And that leads me to bystander intervention, which is one form of allyship. So I started asking, well, what factors are really preventing bystanders in the workplace from intervening in sexual harassment situations? And how can we motivate intervention even in the face of these barriers? And if you click to the next, this is really some new research that I'm just starting to get engaged in. But what I've found is that bystanders often try to avoid direct and formal responses to sexual harassment. So they don't want to confront harassers. It's socially awkward. It might make them feel very anxious. And they also don't want to make, quote unquote, a big deal out of incidents by formally reporting, getting people in trouble, maybe getting people fired, maybe getting the target retaliated against. So they really try to avoid those direct and formal responses. But that's especially true in a toxic organizational culture that tolerates harassment. So when it's all around you all the time, you definitely pick up on the signal that this is accepted here. And it's difficult to respond. A leader character can actually reduce this tendency and help people be allies even in a toxic culture. And practicing bystander intervention skills in virtual reality, which is some of the research I've been engaged in recently, can also help build skills even in difficult contexts. And then my last area is trauma in the workplace. And so we've seen it enter public health and clinical psychology and now education spaces, and it's coming to the workplace as well. So what insights can we learn from a trauma-informed perspective? And if you click to the next, if we really understand trauma, it fundamentally changes the brain, body, and mind, whether that's chronic trauma from childhood or maybe an acute traumatic incident in adulthood. And these changes often lead to survival coping mechanisms that can be dysfunctional in the work context. So leader empathy and organizational supports for folks who are sort of reworking their mind-body connections after trauma can really help break the cycles of trauma in individuals, decrease some of those dysfunctional behaviors, and help heal not just a person, but an entire community. So, Erin, if I still have time, I'd like to get into my next slide, which taps into what you asked me, these new competencies. And I just want to challenge that framing. So I don't think we need new competencies to be inclusive leaders. I think we need to take our current competencies and stretch them and apply them into inclusive contexts or equity, diversity, and inclusion contexts. So I have here, I've highlighted 3 skills that I bet you already have as leaders. And I just want to challenge the audience to think about, how can I take a skill I already have, something I'm already very good at as a leader, and apply it to be more inclusive? So I'm going to start with empathy. Most leaders have empathy, understanding someone else's perspective. You've probably applied this skill in managing conflict or inquiring to learn more about a crisis or a problem in your organization. So if you can't imagine someone else's perspective, or you just can't figure out why are they acting that way, or why do they think this way, or why are they doing what they're doing, or why are they so upset about this, then inquire to understand, to gain that empathy, because we can't really come to a place of inclusion in our work groups without understanding where everybody is coming from. So empathy is a great skill that you've probably already used in other contexts, and you can definitely apply that to be more inclusive. The next is conflict management. So employing both interpersonal and structural techniques to resolve conflict. So this could be a structural technique, could be something like changing a process. So maybe if your work team has like a lot of nasty back and forth during meetings and you feel like people are getting cut out of the conversation, setting an agenda, a process change can really help recenter the team to be more inclusive in those meetings. And there are other processes that you can question and change along the way. You can manage goals. You can clarify communication as an interpersonal technique to manage conflict. And I'm sure you do this in more technical contexts in your work group. I'm sure every leader in this room today has some conflict management skills that they have employed in the past. Think about stretching that to inclusion contexts. And then the last is lifelong learning. So having a genuine curiosity about individuals, their experiences, and having a motivation to learn and seek out opportunities to learn more, to broaden your knowledge base, never assuming. So don't ever walk in assuming you know someone, assuming you know their perspective, but just really lead with curiosity, inquiring to learn more. And I know that everybody here today has a lifelong learning skill already because you're here to do more learning. So I would encourage you, if you find yourself like, oh, I always want to be on the cutting edge of technology, or I always want to learn the next new thing in my industry, apply that passion for learning to learning about your people and learning about cultures that are different than your own, and learning about how people understand different social contexts. And really, when you lead with inquiry and curiosity, that will get you so far in setting an inclusive tone in your work group and steps in the right direction to that inclusive leadership. And so I really challenge you, think about the skills you have now and how you can stretch them to be inclusive. And with that, I think I'll pass it back to Erin.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Kim, I saw you nodding a lot, so I'll be excited to get your take on this once Barnini has finished her section. And I'd encourage our audience too, what was most meaningful from what you heard Shannon talk about and what Kim talked about? You can feel free to put that in the chat. If this has brought up questions for you, we'd love to know so that we can answer those when we move to the open discussion period. I know for myself, I liked that framing to tell me that I actually have agency in this, that I actually might have these skills already within my toolkit of being a leader. And how can I start to think about, like you said, applying those to be inclusive? And I think that's a really wonderful transition point to hear from Barnini, because I'm wondering, Barnini, if you can start to help us understand, what does it actually mean to be inclusive? Because I know a lot of your research helps us to start to understand and co-locate what that might actually look like. And I wonder if you can tell us, what does the research tell us about what that means? And sometimes I know you might have to start from a space of what it means to have not been in an inclusive environment.
Thank you so much, Erin. I am so excited to jump into this conversation and add to the generative ideas that are coming up. So I'm going to be talking about a bottom-up approach to inclusivity and inclusive leadership that is accessible to everybody in an organization or in a particular context, and how we can all start participating in creating more just organizations in our everyday actions. And so could I go to the next slide, please, really quickly? So really, I'm going to be talking about allyship. What is allyship? So all of us have a layperson understanding of what allyship is, but just to reinforce what it means, an ally typically refers to an individual who is relatively more privileged, who challenges oppression, advocates on behalf of somebody who's relatively marginalized. So one would think of a man supporting or advocating on behalf of a woman. And it's considered a positive relationship between marginalized individuals and their relatively more privileged allies. So very much a bottom-up approach to inclusivity. I saw a question in the chat about performativity, and I love that because it perfectly segues into what I was going to talk about, which is there have been questions raised about what is effective allyship and what may not be so effective, what may sort of veer into the territory of a little bit of performativity. And so questions arose during the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, where people were posting black squares on their social media. And whether that is truly effective or does it really create tangible change, as well as, sort of posting pride flags. And this is very much a starting, it's a stepping stone, it's a starting point for a lot of inclusive allyship work to happen. But it was raising questions in my mind about, well, how do we translate that into more effective, outcome-oriented allyship? And so I have a picture of the squad here from the US Congress, because it really summarizes effective allyship as I find from my own research. So it is ongoing, it is action-oriented, and it is very much built on solidarity with the communities and the people you're trying to support. And so I'm going to be talking about findings that I have from a research project I conducted on workplace allyship, where I interviewed 60 people from organizations. So these were dyads of racialized women and their nominated allies. So they chose their own workplace allies to participate in the study in a large city in the Pacific Northwest. And what I found was that essentially if I distill my findings, the most effective allies were those who were willing to use their power to advocate for change. Even if that might make them uncomfortable, even if that entailed making some mistakes or putting themselves at some level of calculated risk. So could I go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And I want to talk about 3 high-level ideas or 3 high-level action-oriented strategies that can make for effective allyship. So 1, in your allyship work, I found that it was really important to center the needs of the individual or the community you're supporting. This is part of what Shannon was talking about. Are you educating yourself on the communities that you're trying to support, what they need, and what the individual might need? Are you having conversations with them? Are you accessing resources that are available on these things? And there's various facets to it, but really it begins from approaching allyship from a place of curiosity, humility, and trusting in the other's knowledge. And I have some little snippets of stories from the data I collected because I think they're really powerful at illustrating exactly what I'm talking about. And so Vera, who was one of my racialized women in the study, she talked about her ally, Trevor, and she said, I told Trevor about a discriminatory event and he got so mad about it. I told him, have your anger elsewhere and then come and support me. And he got it. Knowing that he was so open, I could then say, this is what I need support on. And Trevor, on the other hand, was wonderful about that. And in my interview with him, he cited the same exact situation. And he said, I remember her talking me through one specific situation. And I got angry about it because she had to deal with that. And that was coming from a place of privilege. But then he came to a realization that she doesn't have the opportunity to get angry about these things. And that made me reassess and think what support looks like. So something really key that comes out of it is a willingness to listen to what the other person is telling you, maybe make a mistake and be comfortable with that mistake, learn from that and move on. Second, again, revolves around learning. So building awareness of your own privilege and power, so educating yourself, being willing to be a little uncomfortable, taking risks. And so I give an example of Charlotte and Violet. Charlotte was a Black woman, and she spoke about her ally who was actually an Asian woman. And she said, Violet learns about EDI. She's putting herself at risk when she speaks to people or when she focuses on what I need, when she stands up for things. And when I asked Violet why she was doing that, because she was herself a racialized woman as well, she said that I have my own lived experiences of dealing with racism and sexism, but her lens is not the same as mine just because we're both women of color. It's not like I'm ignoring my experiences. And so she was very much focused on speaking up for Charlotte in situations where Charlotte was experiencing inequities that were unique to her because she was a Black woman. And she really would speak up for her in situations where Charlotte was not around or Charlotte was not present in the room, but using her own access to power and privilege in those situations. And then finally, this is fairly, I think, obvious, but I do want to restate it, is focusing on tangible action instead of mere intent. Most of us in this Zoom room have the right intentions. We know that we want to focus on inclusive workplaces, but then figuring out what that means in terms of actual action can be hard. And so a couple of things that I found worked really well were, if you have access to power or senior positions in organizations, sponsorship and nominations for opportunities for high-level positions can be really powerful in actually creating tangible change for the people that you're being an ally to, as well as Shannon mentioned, intervening or disrupting mistreatment, practicing that because that can be uncomfortable. Maybe, getting used to the feeling of discomfort as long as it's not terribly unsafe for you, and leaning into that as you can. And I have this really powerful example, again, from my data. Phoebe, who was, again, a Black woman, she said about her ally, Patrick, he's been the best boss of my career to date. I always felt like he had my back. He really saw my value. As a young person who's a Black woman, it's easy to be dismissed by others. And Patrick, who was a much older, senior white man, he gave Phoebe a lot of really visible, high potential opportunities in the organization. So he said, I knew in a moment this was an exceptional person. We had an offer $1 million donation for a project, and I handed that project to Phoebe because I knew I could trust her to do that. And so essentially, to summarize, what I find from my data is that a lot of good, effective allyship behavior is about learning, being comfortable with making mistakes, and focusing your allyship around tangible action that actually help the individuals that you're trying to support. And I'll hand over to Eric in that moment.
Thank you so much, Barnini. It was really fascinating. I loved the fact that you were able to bring this beautiful qualitative storytelling into how you were framing out your research outcomes. And I think my big takeaway from this, if I combine listening to Shannon telling us that we have these skills and we need to stretch them, I think the storytelling allows this new space to think about, where are these really vibrant spaces that could occur in my workplace? How might I apply those skills of empathy, those skills of being able to change process, those skills of being able to really lean in and ask questions, to be curious. And the other thing that comes to my mind, and Kim, I'm wondering if you can speak into this, is I start to hear out of your story that you built here, Barnini, that maybe one thing we need to do is start to flip our script on allyship as well, and start to ask ourselves, who counts me as an ally? So instead of maybe declaring myself an ally, I wonder what happens when I start to hear from my colleagues, hear from those people in my organization, and they start to say, in fact, I do find you to be an ally. And I'm wondering, Kim, if you've seen any of those transformations happen in your workplace and what your learnings were from hearing from Shannon and Barnini.
Boy, there's a lot. There's a lot in there. So maybe I'll just touch on the question that you just posed, Erin, around allyship and this concept of, I guess sometimes I phrase it as aspiring ally. I think that's also terminology that we're trying to socialize in our organizations, because a lot of times around allyship as well, there's still this underlying fear that people are going to misstep. And that fear often leads to inaction. It leads to, not engaging in important conversations, to not, standing up when someone needs that advocate in the room. And so this concept of being an aspiring ally, I think, gives people more, leeway to understand that this is a journey, that there has to be room for learning and growth and perhaps even missteps, because that's such an important part of this as well. And we don't want the idea of perfection to hold people back. And I think that this concept of perfection, that I'm not going to say anything because I'm not going to get it right. I'm not going to deliver the land acknowledgement because I might mispronounce the words. I'm not, like, it comes up over and over again, and just reminding people that in order for us to move forward collectively, we have to leave space for each of us to learn and grow and evolve. And I think that's one of the key sort of elements of allyship as well. A couple things you mentioned, both in Shannon's research, where she was sort of leaning into the fact that leaders have a lot of these skills, and I think that's something that we've really tried to push around our leadership capabilities as well. Because one of the things I've heard over the years is often, well, I don't I don't have time for D&I. I can't add anything more to my plate. I'm busy and overwhelmed. And I try to remind people that this is it's not an item to add to your to-do list. It's a lens, it's an approach, it's a way of being, a way of thinking, of speaking, of acting, of leading. And the themes that you shared, Shannon, just are truly universal themes that extend far beyond diversity, equity, inclusion, but just what is needed in today's environment for good leadership. So some of the things, in our organization, we are actively working and talking about empathy. We are having conversations with leaders about what does courage look like, and courageous conversations and difficult conversations. What does accountability look like? That's also, and humility. And these are not characteristics that I think we've, historically, when we've defined leadership, decisive and strong and, authoritative and having all the answers. And, you can sort of have a list over here. And then we have this sort of evolved list of really what capabilities leaders need to have. And this doesn't apply just to diversity, equity, inclusion, but really in navigating this complex landscape that we're in, both from an economic, environmental, from a hybrid workplace. Like there's a lot of complexities in our workplaces today where these skills really can transcend. And maybe we'll touch on allyship in a minute, but I'll stop there just to see if there's sort of comments.
Thanks, Kim, so much. So looking at our time, I think maybe we'll move into questions. And I'm going to open this first question up to all three of you to give a response to. We were lucky enough that panel participants sent in questions ahead of time. So we'll start with one of those questions. And I'm going to sort of build on this question based on the conversation we just had. So the root of the question is really, could you suggest a way to start having, I think, inclusive conversations around coaching when maybe an employee isn't maybe meeting goals that were set forward? And I'm wondering if we can think about this more broadened skill set we're talking about that may require humility, that may require allyship. How might we bring those to the table when we think about having conversations with employees, those sometimes difficult conversations where things maybe haven't gone as planned? I'm wondering if each of you could maybe respond to that. And then we can, Martha, I know you've been monitoring the chat. We can move to some of the questions that are in the chat. Kim, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things at play. One is, this conversation around just coaching in general. I think coaching is such a powerful skill set and is something that I think a lot of organizations, at least in scanning the landscape and talking to my colleagues in other organizations, I don't think that we've built robust coaching cultures. And so there is a skill set there. Certainly people are certified coaches and, we hope all organizations can leverage that expertise. But this concept of coaching is certainly another skill set that you could really lean into that really can bring your leadership to the next level. And I would just say, in terms of performance, a lot of the things we've touched on already today, tie into this conversation, like being curious about understanding an individual's lived experience and the perspectives and challenges that they might be facing that are impacting that performance. I mean, often, things are, as I say, they're not black and white. They're not yes and no. Everything's not on a binary, and really sort of exploring the gray and, what is going on with this particular individual and where are the opportunities to provide that coaching and guidance that will help that individual really perhaps overcome it. And maybe some of those challenges are simple ones. And in some cases, yes, sometimes people just, aren't able to live up to expectations. But I know that most people tend to be open to feedback and coaching and support. And I don't think we do enough of that in our cultures generally. And so when I think about inclusive culture, I think part of that has to be incorporated, or we have to think about it through a feedback lens and how we're investing in people and growing people and giving people opportunities to really hone their skills and achieve their full potential, because in a lot of cases there are barriers beyond just it's not a capability question. It's just something in the environment is really preventing them from being successful.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I think that's a really beautiful last point, that often we focus on this as a capability issue, as a strengths deficit model. That's often how we approach this, right? And so we think that the person hasn't aligned themselves to where we have set this supposed bar. And I think what you're encouraging us to do is start to say, well, where are the embedded strengths in the individual? And let's bring the conversation past capabilities to think about where barriers may exist, preventing the fulsome expression of these capabilities. Barnini, I'm wondering if you could add a comment to this conversation, and then Shannon, will move to you.
Yeah, adding to what Kim said, especially about what leadership looks like, there's a lot of research that's come out on what effective leadership is in the recent, I would say, last 7 to 10 years, which really reframes our idea of somebody who's assertive, who doesn't admit to mistakes, who's masculine, who sort of, presents this unbreakable version of leaders, to a more humble leader. So Adam Grant, who's a professor at Harvard, he talks about humility as a very, very important skill that leaders must possess to be effective leaders in both in terms of the bottom line, but also in terms of just being a good manager. And a huge part of being a humble leader is the willingness to make mistakes, is the willingness to say, I am not an expert in XYZ, but I'm going to hire experts. I'm going to divert resources towards this to make sure that we're meeting these requirements. Also, in 2023, where our workforces are increasingly diverse, where a huge proportion of employees entering the organizations are from different backgrounds and different races and ethnicities, it would be something that leaders must be able to pay attention to. How do you manage a workforce that looks different from you, that has experiences that are different from you? And part of that is perspective taking. So can you put yourself in the other person's shoes and think of what their experiences might be like, that you have not experienced, but you are able to empathize with and generate solutions for if there are barriers. So those were the two things I wanted to add to that.
Thank you. And Shannon?
So I think to this conversation, I'll add a perspective from my sort of training and development lens. I know from the research on mentoring marginalized employees that it's really important to affirm their belongingness in whatever work environment you're in. Like, you deserve to be here. You were selected for this job for a reason. I know you have the capabilities because maybe you've seen it in certain contexts, just not the one they're currently underperforming in. So it's really important to affirm their belonging in the environment, but don't handle marginalized people with kid gloves. Everyone needs development. And I think sometimes we get afraid that if I give bad news or critical feedback to a marginalized person, then I'm somehow being mean to them and I don't want them to feel excluded or picked on, so I just won't give them that feedback. And really, that's the opposite of what you should do. You should give the same level of critical feedback, but also support and coaching to respond to that feedback and grow from that feedback that you would any other person. And so it's a mixture of reinforcing or affirming you belong here, but also doing the hard work of inquiring to understand their perspective, to investigate where the missed performance is coming from. What is the root of the problem? Is it a motivation thing? Are incentives not aligned? Is it a direction problem? Do I need to give clearer instructions? Is it a resources problem? So I haven't properly supplied you to perform. Or maybe it is an ability problem and this person really does need some concentrated training and skill development, but you as the leader can probably offer all of those things. So don't handle a marginalized person, a woman or a person of color or a person with a disability, as though they can't take that critical feedback. They can, and they want it just as much as everybody else, so they can improve too. So that's what I'll add.
And I think all of your answers together blend so beautifully to give us a really good picture of what it means to actually enact humility, because I'm going to need to enact humility to actually get at understanding what may be those spaces or barriers that could be causing this decrease in capacity to perform. But I think your point is so important, Shannon, that if we do not seek to continue to support and develop diverse employees, there will be a ceiling at which that person is not going to be able to ascend through the hierarchy of our system. And so if we can't work in a development model, which is really what I think you're all encouraging us to think about, is we have to have really humble development models to better understand those lived experiences of individuals, but at the same time, really proactively work with individuals to think about and seek out those areas for development so that we can see career progression. So thank you so much for adding that nuance, because I think it's an often missed point when we talk about what it means to manage really diverse teams. Martha, I know you have been monitoring the chat, and I'm wondering if you would like to offer in one of the questions that's there
Sure.
that you think our panelists could answer.
Yeah, well, and there's kind of a common theme among the questions that I see, which is about this alignment between what we say we're doing and what we're actually doing. So how do we prioritize? How do we get people to pay attention to this? So a couple of themes around that, but Marissa started it off with, how do you ensure training isn't perceived as performative? And Barnini responded to that a little bit with the allyship question, which I think also addresses the best for women.ca comment about allyship to accomplice, right? What do we really mean by that? But given that it's in some of the other comments too, or questions, how do we align what we're saying with what we're actually doing? I think starting with the performative question is good.
Who wants to take that first?
I can take a stab at it. So I will just reiterate that training is not the panacea. It is not the solution to inclusion in organizations. It is a piece of the puzzle. And so if we're going to do training on anything, right, we need to first do a proper needs analysis. What is going right in this organization that we can enhance and continue to grow? What is going wrong where we need to change directions and do something a little different? And that's probably going to involve changing some systems, changing some processes, changing some policies or directions that we give employees and leaders. And so once you sort of figure out, okay, here's a problem we can tackle. Okay, so if we change this system, if we change this policy, if we change this procedure, what do employees need to know to adapt to that change? What do leaders need to know to guide people through this change? Well, now we've got some skills identified that can be learning objectives in a training program. So you design around that. And I always like to encourage to keep it positive, because no one wants to go to a training where they're sort of typecast as the bad guy and that feel like the whole room is staring at them and they're guilty of something they haven't even done. So keep it positive, make a positive role for people to play. And when you're training them, say, all those conversations we've been having about changes we could make in our organization and how we've been talking about how our values could be enacted in different work settings and in different situations. Well, now we've identified some policies we're going to change, some procedures we're going to change, and we've developed this training program to help you be a team player in those changes. And make it interactive. Give employees a voice in that learning space to identify challenges of implementing the training and collaborate together to address those challenges. I think too often we think of training as a knowledge dump onto a bunch of sponges, and that is not how adults learn. We need to give them a voice in that process and have it be very collaborative and iterative. And as Barnini mentioned in her talk about allyship, it has to lead to actionable, real change. It can't just, if it's just saying, we want to be inclusive and here's some terms and definitions, that is very performative. But if the training helps people build skills to make real process and system changes, culture changes, that's going to be effective. And then, of course, always measure the effectiveness. Always double check that it's working. Always, always, always.
That's great, Shannon. Kim, I don't know if you have something to add. And we've also got some other questions related to kind of the next step on this performative versus actually doing it question too. So go ahead, Kim, please.
Shannon's answer was amazing.
Okay.
So
Okay. Well, why don't I jump to the next two, and Kim, you can start with this, because we've got two questions here, which are really I think the next step on this, how do you get people to prioritize this? So on the one hand, Gori Bular asked, how do you continue this dialogue when senior leaders are really focused on financial targets or other kinds of goals, and when there may even be fatigue around the topic? So how do you, you might have the posters, you might have the policies, but how do you get people to really engage it when there's a lot of other stuff going on? Or as Diana Murphy said, when the organization says and thinks that they're getting it, they've got capital D diversity, but they're not actually engaging the hard stuff. So that's, and it's kind of what I think you said at the beginning, Kim, this critical tipping point of moving from the programmatic into the business led.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things, just referring back to that model. And, I've been in my role now 2.5 years. We have a 3-year strategy, and that strategy has been active for about 2 years. And I remember, we built out our BRGs. We did all the sort of foundational pieces that I would say when we think about D&I sort of strategies within corporations, those foundational pieces are built out. And I remember saying to my leader, now the hard work begins, because the real change, the systemic, the mindset shifts, the behavioral changes, those are so much harder. And, as Shannon has mentioned as well, this idea of D&I training, you get people give you the eye roll, if they're invited to a D&I training. And I do believe that there's a place for training in the context that Shannon has mentioned. But it's very important that it's leveraged as a tool in the toolbox. But I think we've spent a lot of time in organizations over the last number of years on awareness. And now it's time for action. And I think that society is demanding that action. As I mentioned earlier, the narratives and the discourse and the polarization that's happening in society. I think shareholders, employees, there's increasing demands on the business to be paying attention to this work. So when we say leaders, and the comment from the chat was, our leaders are focused on financial performance. Well, if they're focused on financial performance, they sure as heck should be thinking about the culture that they're creating within their organization. And for a few reasons, and this was alluded to earlier in the comments and mentioned directly, the dynamic or the makeup of our workforces is changing. What younger, and I'll say younger people, being not a younger person anymore, but younger people are what they're expecting from their employers, that there is more values alignment. What are you doing for the environment? Where are my values showing up in your organization? And how is this organization going to embody the things that I believe in? And where am I going to have opportunities to continue the things that, and put emphasis on the things that matter to me? And so organizations are really having to rethink and shift and adjust, especially for those of us that are long tenured, that have been in the workplace a long time, really reevaluating that relationship with employees and what our organizations need to be doing. Because talent, our biggest cost is our people, in terms of our dollars. So when we're talking about financial performance, turnover costs companies a huge amount of money. And so that retention piece, if you can tie this all in from the perspective of again, the financials and the business performance, there's so many linkages that are, obvious to some of us and less obvious to other people.
Without having to say what's the capital B, capital C business case, right?
Yeah, I think we've moved past that too.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that, right? We talked about it on this call, right? That a lot's been mentioned, researched, publicized around the business case, but I think now it's a people case, it's a human case.
Nice.
The things that we're talking about here today are human behaviors, are expectations we should have of each other as just human beings coexisting on this planet. And yes, it applies in the workplace context, but I think these are all aspects of our life skills that we can take into other aspects of our lives.
Thank you. We have one other question, Erin. Do we have time for one more?
Sure do.
Which I think is Paul Wilkinson, thoughtful question about compliance as a false foundation for inclusivity and training and so on. And Paul's asking, does the potential cost of past mistakes in litigation settlements hold back progress towards a better future in organizations more than it drives that progress? So I read this as another reason for that big tipping point, or the challenge of moving from kind of 2 to 3 on the maturity scale, Kim. And if our worries about litigation and past mistakes are so strong that they prevent our progress, how do we overcome that?
Barnini, did you want to start us off?
Sure. I might sort of take a step back, and I think there's a real need to reframe inclusion, because as soon as we approach it from a place of litigation, it's going to cost us money. If somebody sues us for discrimination, we're creating this idea of, here's this person who inclusivity is for and diversities. This is a person who's diverse, and I'm not part of that. So there's the other who needs EDI, and there's me who doesn't need EDI. And I think as soon as we, like, that's been the assumption of EDI in quite a few organizations thus far, right? The idea that I'm doing it for someone else. I really think we need to reframe that, and a reframing of it happens through building connections with people who are not similar to you. So how can you start seeing other people's humanity and their worth and their value as important in itself, instead of the potential costs to the organization or potential value that they're adding to the organization, which of course is important, but how do we recognize their humanity as valuable in itself? And so that raises the question of, what is why are we doing EDI in organizations? The bottom line argument has been made over decades, but are we doing it now to create more just workplaces? Are we doing it now for better spaces that our next generations are entering? And so that begs the question then, who is going to be the expert on what we need from EDI? Who is telling us what we need from training, what we need from policies, what we need from practices, recruitment? Are we asking the people who are experiencing barriers in organizations what they need? A lot of times EDI is like top down. And so somebody who may not have had certain experiences or certain hurdles is making policies for individuals who have very, very different life experiences. And so I feel like that was a very abstract answer, but really reframing the fact that EDI is not for the other, but for somebody that's humanity is valuable, and what they need is I think a way to move forward.
But I think you did a really lovely job of maybe reframing for all of us that if we try to assess moving forward based on a risk model, we may have actually not assessed risk properly, because if we had built the EDI initiatives to begin with through that deep lens of listening, curiosity, understanding who it's for, we may not have actually come to the outcome we came to, which is what I think all of you have been talking about all day, is that inclusion is context specific to the humans that are in the space you are working in. And so we can't just wholesale take practices from one space to another without distilling them through understanding who really is in our space, who will benefit from these outcomes, what do benefits look like, and how do we manage those benefits forward across the broadest number of people within our organization. So I think you've given us a really wonderful place to start thinking about how do we maybe reassess risk as we move forward to that last phase of the evolution that Kim started us out with. I mean, I do want to also say we also had a wonderful note from Karen Friday Field, who really did endorse for us that leader character is also another set of those skills and competencies we can layer into how we engage and ask questions of one another as human beings within our workplaces. We're coming to near the end, and we just have a few moments for closing remarks. I just want to remind everyone who is in our audience today that you will be getting a message back from Ivey Events. In that message, you'll receive a recording of today's session. You will receive a series of handouts and resources that take you through some actual questions and scenarios to work on how might I utilize the skills I already have to come to effective answers for some of the scenarios given in the little workbook. You'll also receive a survey and the series of slides. We're interested, just like we said, about measuring and understanding how did we do. So we'd really love to hear from you to understand what did you learn today and what was most meaningful. To close out, I'd love to send it back to our panelists to give a final closing remark. Maybe you can talk about what was most meaningful for you today or what you'd really like participants to take away from the conversation. We'll start with Barnini, then we'll move to Shannon and Kim. If you can give us the last comment, please.
I'd like to reiterate that inclusion or EDI, the conversation around EDI is really about seeing each other as part of the same ecosystem and seeing worth in each other. And it is really about appreciating each other's humanity. So I'm going to go back to a very primal place of we're connected and we're part of the same ecosystem. And so as soon as we start thinking of EDI for this other exclusive group that I'm not part of, that's where we start moving into directions of defensiveness and instead of curiosity. So I would really say approach this from a place of curiosity, compassion, and think of it as part of the same ecosystem.
Wonderful. Shannon?
I think I'd like to end on the idea that inclusion should be inclusive. So whoever you are, however you identify, you should be able to find a role, a positive role for yourself to play in the act of inclusion. At the end of the day, I think Kim mentioned this, it really rips off what Barnini was just saying. We're all human beings, we're social creatures, we crave connection with each other. If you are a person in this world, you have what it takes to make someone else feel included in a space with you. And I know all of you as leaders today on this call, that you have some skills you really excel at in terms of your own leadership style. And I challenge everyone to find a way to include yourself and your wonderful skills in the process of inclusion.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And Kim, if you can give us your final thoughts, please.
Sure. I have an expression that I often rephrase or recite, I should say, to myself, and it's gentle pressure relentlessly applied when it comes to DEI work. So for those of you who are on the call who are D&I practitioners who are trying to affect change in your organizations, we talked about scale, we talked about, reach and impact and those small actions and behaviors that are happening throughout the organization. But sometimes it also means we have to spend time one-on-one with people and really help bring them along in this journey, and knowing where you can push and where you need to perhaps pull back a little bit. It is a constant dance, but you need to know your organization. You need to know the culture that you're operating in. And I just like to keep that always in mind. Gentle pressure, relentlessly applied, because that's what this work is. Because you can't push too far, you'll get a knee-jerk reaction, but you've got to push just hard enough to keep that progress moving forward. So keep going. All progress is progressive. So let's keep moving things forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to each of our panelists for sharing your really deep wisdom, thoughts for us. I think you did a wonderful job of showing us just how powerful it can be when we blend theory and practice together, because there are spaces where theory and practice can reinforce each other. And then there are these really wonderful dynamic spaces where we can both learn from theory and practice to actually create and discover new ways of moving forward within our organizations. Thank you to all of our participants for spending your morning with us for a little bit of it. We hope you found some new meaning making in this discussion, and we'll look forward to hearing the results of your feedback and being able to join with you in future dialogues in this series. Thank you very much, everyone.